Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing a review for The Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey. This is the first book in her 500 Kingdoms series. This is actually a reread for me. I loved the 500 Kingdoms series when I was younger, and I am kind of on a rereading spree, trying to reread a bunch of old favorites to see what I think of them now. This takes place in the 500 Kingdoms, which has a very specific magic called the Tradition. It's less like a spell casting kind of magic and more of just an ambient world magic. This magic has its own consciousness in a way. In this world, if anyone's life even starts to resemble a fairy tale, myth, story, folktale, whatever it is, the tradition starts to try and force their life and the circumstances around them into following this storyline exactly. It can manipulate other people, it can manipulate circumstances, even your own emotions and mindset. This book follows Elena, who starts out as a Cinderella retelling, whose life the tradition is trying to manipulate, but some things in her life don't perfectly match up, and she is saved by a fairy godmother. In this world, fairy godmothers are people who use the magic of the tradition in order to help people who are trapped in these stories. They either help people to find their happy endings if they are in a happily ever after kind of story, or they try to protect people who are in stories that have sad endings. So fairy godmothers use the tradition's own magic to manipulate people's lives for the better, as opposed to the tradition, whose manipulation is completely indiscriminate. It doesn't care if it's making your life better or worse, it only cares if your life matches a story. After she is saved by the fairy godmother, Elena discovers that the fairy godmother is looking for an apprentice, and so Elena becomes her apprentice and becomes the next fairy godmother. So this story follows her as she is learning to become a fairy godmother, and then also sometime after she has become a fairy godmother and she is on her own, and her kind of learning the ropes. I really like the world and setting of this story. I think that this tradition kind of magic is a very unique kind of magic. I haven't seen anything quite like it before, and it's really interesting to see how it manipulates people's lives and the way that the characters and the fairy godmothers work with it to help save people. So I definitely enjoyed the premise and the world and magic system of this story. It's a little bit more like a feely magic system than a really structured magic system. It relies very heavily on just like intuition and kind of knowing what to do instead of a very strict structure or system. I also liked the aspect of the plot of following Elena through her first like year or so of being a fairy godmother on her own, that it isn't just like, all right, now you've learned it, go. We get to watch her learn the ropes and stand on her own 2 feet and kind of figure it out as she goes, and sort of figure out how she's going to set up her life and set up her relationship to the kingdoms that she is taking care of. There is a parallel plot which follows another character named Alexander, who is a prince that needs to be taught a lesson, as many fairy tales do. His life is starting to follow the route of a fairy tale, and Elena intervenes as his fairy godmother to teach him a lesson and teach him to be a better person. So this is actually a dual perspective story, and so we get a parallel storyline about him and his inner monologue as he is going through trials and being taught this lesson. In terms of pacing, there were some slow parts to the book. It was almost 500 pages. I feel like it probably could have been a little shorter than that. There were some periods of time that just felt very monotonous, but overall I think the pacing was pretty good and pretty interesting, and the plot was interesting enough to follow. As I said, there are 2 main characters in this story. Elena, who is really like the main character, but then we get a secondary main character, Alexander, who is the prince that is being taught a lesson. And then we also have some side characters who are brownies, which are a kind of like a house elf. They're one of the fae, and they are house fairies that they take care of the home. For Elena's character, I didn't have a really strong feeling of what her character was like. Most of what I know about her character are things that the author really told us in a very straightforward way, not necessarily things that I was shown or gleaned from watching her character. So I liked her character well enough. She was very hardworking, she was very clever and very good at outwitting the tradition, but I didn't really have a strong feeling for what she was like beyond that, and most of those things are things that were just kind of told to us about her personality. As for the secondary character Alexander, he starts out pretty terrible and is a character that kind of hate, and he's one of those people who his inner monologue a lot of times directed at women is about like, oh, like she just wants to be dominated because that's what women really want, and like things like that. So he's kind of the worst at the beginning, and I really didn't like him. But the purpose of his storyline is that he's being taught a lesson by these fairy tales and that he is growing over the course of the story. So he does grow and change over the course of the story, which I appreciated. But again, with his storyline, there was just a moment that kind of like flipped a switch that was a little too sudden for me personally, but there was magic involved, so that explained it. It wasn't just like somehow happened, makes no sense. But really, the brownies were my favorite part of the story. Some of them are so sassy and they're just wonderful. They're very grounded and straightforward and really on top of things. They take no nonsense from anybody, and yeah, they're so sassy sometimes, and I loved them. So they were the side characters, but they were the ones that I really had the clearest feeling of what they were like as people, and they had the most personality, and I was the most attached to the brownies. In terms of the writing, I didn't have a very strong opinion about the writing. I think that the writing of this was very plain and straightforward, so in that way it was easy to read. Personally, I tend to like more lyrical, pretty writing. So I thought for me, the writing was not as immersive or as easy to just like get lost in, but I don't think that that was because it was poor writing. It was just very plain, and that's not the kind of writing that I really jive with. Overall, I enjoyed this book. It was not my favorite, and I think I didn't enjoy it as much rereading it now as I did when I was younger, but it was fun to read again, and it definitely had some strengths, especially in terms of the premise of the story and the magic system, and I'm interested to read the rest of the series. This one is very different from the rest of the series because, as I said, this follows the fairy godmother, whereas all of the other books in the series follow characters in different stories, and the fairy godmother shows up in their stories as their fairy godmother, but this is the only one that follows the fairy godmother directly. So all of the other books in this series will probably be very different from this one. I also know that this wasn't my favorite in the series, so as I said, I enjoyed it, and I'm willing to continue on reading the rest of the series and being optimistic about that one. But this one wasn't great to me, so I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. So that is all for my review of The Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey. Let me know if you have read this book and what you thought of it if you did. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!